This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 165. The arrival of decoupled technical architectures in general, and in particular the fast-growing adoption of headless CMSs, creates a whole new batch of people management and organizational change issues. You don't typically look to a software developer for help in such matters, but Low Etheridge is not your typical developer. Their background in social work and conflict resolution lets Low bring a unique and constructive perspective to these new challenges.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 165 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I am really excited to welcome to the show Lo Etheridge. Lo is a developer relations, developer, like a lead or senior developer relations person at Hygraph, which is a content federation CMS. Welcome, Lo. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you do there at Hygraph.
Great. Hi, Larry. Thanks for having me. Like Larry said, my name is Lo. I'm a senior DevRel at Hygraph, and I work on a variety of things. I make a lot of technical content, tutorials and guides. I talk a lot about content, the content editor experience, and sort of the collaboration between developers and editors, things like that. But I think what is more interesting, perhaps, or unusual is that I have sort of a very unique segue into tech. I started out as a social worker in the field of harm reduction and sort of community-based research and sort of program development, right? So I sort of transitioned into tech from working a lot with people of various roles and situations on a team together, leading those teams and getting them to all accomplish a single task, right? Even though that these folks are all in different places in their lives. For instance, sometimes on my team, I would have 2 postdocs, I would have a nurse, I would have folks who were in active addiction recovery, people who were active using, interns of all different kinds. And we would all need to work as a team to, accomplish our goals. And it taught me a lot about how people work on teams and how folks work together and how you have to sort of communicate information in a multitude of ways, depending on who you're talking to.
Well, that's why I was so excited when I first met you. We met, I can't remember how we first met, but we most recently hung out at the Decoupled Days conference. And I was just like, wow, a people, not just people focused, but a people, somebody with a deep background in people stuff coming to the content world. And one of the things we talked about, well, I just want to talk quickly about the context for that, because that conference, Decoupled Days, is all about decoupled web architectures in this new world of the headless CMSs that you all sell at Hygraph, but also the people stuff that comes along with that. You said this brilliant thing at the conference, like, the architectures can be decoupled, but we got to keep the people coupled and recoupled as necessary. Can you talk a little bit about there's so many things we talked before we went on the air about, like content modeling and other activities, but what are the main people challenges you see as you're out there in the world helping people understand Hygraph and headless CMSs in general?
Let's see. There are a few, right? And I think some of the big ones are sort of these content silos, right? And the disconnect between teams within an organization. Like sometimes you'll have the marketing team and they're working on something, and you have another team, and they might be working on the same overall organizational project, right? But neither one of those teams knows what type of content they're writing, where they're getting their sort of raw data or original source information from. And a lot of times that creates a lot of duplication of effort, right? So you see that a lot. You see this sort of disconnect where, teams should be sort of coupled together in an organization working to accomplish the same business level goals, being siloed off and not really having visibility. So I think visibility is sort of a key idea, and visibility is sort of a multi-layered thing, right? You have, for instance, developers. They sometimes don't have visibility in a literal way, meaning they don't know how the things that they are building are actually working in a practical context, right? So this tool that they built or the CMS that they've built, how are the folks who are actually going to use it within the organization? How does that fit in with their process and workflow? You see sort of those disconnects, I think. And I don't know that without some sort of education, and really pushing that sort of collaborative effort, that federation by itself fixes that, right? You really have to sort of, along with the technical federation, you have to actually literally the true definition of federation, which is sort of these autonomous states and groups linking together to accomplish one overall or many overall goals, right? So that also needs to be in place for really, I would say, any technical implementation, but particularly when we're talking about effective CMS and great editorial experiences.
Yeah, and as you say that, I'm realizing that the concept, like you just distinguished between the technical federation and the human federation that needs to happen. And the first is relatively easy technical accomplishment that many of folks are working on, but the human part of it is so much more interesting. Tell me a little bit about, one thing I want to back up just a little bit and talk about, I don't know that all of my audience knows exactly what a developer relations person does. So maybe if you can talk just a little bit, because typically, as the name implies, you're focused on developers, but you are unique, if not unique, but special in that world, in that you focus as much on the editorial and authoring experience as you do on the developers. So can you talk a little bit about the context of your work with the humans in these various organizations?
Sure. So there are lots of different developer relations, DevRels for short, developer advocates you'll hear. Sometimes you hear developer evangelists. And really, sort of, we as a group are tasked with maintaining a sort of a good and continuous relationship with developers who may use a specific product or a specific program language, and really sort of straddle sort of a multitude of teams, right, in organizations that have DevRel or Dev Advocate teams. So for instance, the team that I'm on, we are part of the marketing department, but we also need to liaison with the support engineers who are in the community helping developers use our platform. We are also integrated with the product team. We're integrated with the technical writing team, with the sales team. So it's really kind of this interesting straddle between sort of technical ability, developer skills of some kind, because there's DevRels of all different kinds of, technical platforms and languages and so forth. But it's sort of a cross between that, but also very diplomat-like.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, DevRels are ambassadors between, sort of the product and the developers who use that product. And I think where I have come to, since I've sort of fell in love with the sort of niche area of tech that is sort of content management systems, is realizing that it's the developers, but also that you can empower developers to really think about their whole organization, and specifically the people who are actually going to manage their content and create their content in the system that developers build. So I focus specifically on that relationship because I think it is critical to the success of an overall technical implementation like a CMS.
Yeah, Dean Barker famously talks about the reason people abandon and just hate their CMSs in general is that kind of attention has not been given, that the editors are usually or typically ignored. How does that manage? Did you have to fight for that, or did it just, I mean, it comes naturally to you with your background and your approach, but organizationally and just as sort of like in the profession of DevRel, was that a challenge for you to become more people focused like that, or?
I think that I am inherently, as a person, very people focused. My special interest is sort of communication and human behavior. So I think a lot about how humans communicate with each other and how they relate to one another, and what it looks like when it goes well and what it looks like when it goes bad, and sort of the effects of either one of those outcomes, right? So I just think about that naturally a lot, but I think sort of that has led me through the paths that I've taken in life. So one of the most impactful sort of roles that I have had that have led me to sort of my DevRel career now, in addition to my social work experience, was my first sort of full-time non-freelance developer role was at a large public university. And within that public university, I was a part of a very small team that was basically in charge of pretty much all of the campus's WordPress presence. And what ended up happening was we realized, oh, we are doing custom development for the different colleges, for instance, within the university and departments within that university. Oh, but we also need to be doing lots of education, because there is a disconnect between what we're talking about and what folks are trying to do, and us understanding each other. So at first, we need to establish sort of this shared knowledge base, right? So we started doing a lot of education, both at the sort of administrator role of, a CMS, and editor role, and also the developer. So providing education based on role within the context of how you use or build a CMS, depending on who you are. And that really sort of opened up sort of a world for me where I'm like, oh, this is where the work is. This is where the work is. And figuring out how you can get editors and administrators and developers to communicate in a way that makes everyone in the group's life easier, right? Because a lot of times it's just about sort of rethinking the problem and coming up with a strategy that works for everyone. For instance, before we started doing these sort of classes and education around how to use the CMS and how to work with it, what we found was there was a lot of frustration from the in-college developers who were like internal to a college or internal to a department, whereas we were part of central IT. And what we found was there was a lot of frustration there because they were being asked to do things like that they considered small content changes that took away from them actually building out requests that editors and administrators wanted. And on the same side, administrators and editors were frustrated because it took so long to get these changes, and also weren't getting the sort of requests for new features and tools they needed to make their life better and help their work go faster, right? So working on that relationship and understanding, like, and having that pre-conversation, oh, developer at, let's say it's a college of Department of English. If you're building out the CMS or you're building out a process, don't just think about how the tools that you were going to build and connect. Actually talk to the person who asked you to do this and figure out how they actually do their work currently. Because getting that visibility will help you build a better tool, and it will also help you both have a shared knowledge base and understand what the real task and goal is. And from that, you can create some sort of encouragement and empowerment, right? And if you combine that with some education, you allow sort of the editor or the administrator to make those content changes on their own, and you can build the ability for them to do that. And that frees up the developer space and not having to put out those sort of fires, those quick content changes, they can actually focus on building the feature request that you were asking for.
Yeah, you're describing like the classic thing of like everybody's unhappy in that situation because it goes slowly
Right,
because of the way it's set up, and then the developer's like, "Come on, I'm a developer, right? I'm not a content,
right.
updater." But one thing, as you're talking about that, I had this insight the other day. I can't remember. I was listening to a podcast or something about one of these shifts from like the old monolithic structures like WordPress and Drupal and Sitecore and all those kinds of monolithic CMSs to the more decoupled architectures. Is that it occurred to me that it's like in that world, like a WordPress and Drupal, it's like, there's this sort of technical thing that's going on where you're developing like plugins or features and things like that, where the code and the data and the code and the it's all conflated into one thing. Whereas in these decoupled architectures, it's easier to tease out some of that stuff. Has that been a benefit that you like? Am I thinking about that right? Is that one of the benefits of decoupled architectures, that like moving from the plugin mindset to an API sourcing mindset? Is that kind of a fundamental thing that makes this human recoupling easier?
I think so, because it gives you sort of the decoupled architecture, and combined with the ability to create sort of content, a real content strategy and content models, those things combined, I think are major superpowers, right? Because it gives you the ability to customize, and it gives you the ability as both a developer and an editor to fully create a process that is tailored to what you need to do.
Mm-hmm. And that you just said two of my favorite phrases: content modeling and content strategy. That's my life right there. And
Yeah.
I'm glad to see that we intersect with that. But and one of the things about like content modeling, there's a couple of my favorite content modelers talk about the distinction between like the activity of modeling your content, of talking to all the stakeholders, figuring out what's technically feasible, what the users need, all the stuff that needs to happen, and then the building of the content model itself, which is a more technical activity. How does that differ now? Like you've moved out of this WordPress, where that was your, like you said, your first big tech role was that WordPress kind of role into, and now you're in this fully decoupled world. How does content modeling compare across those experiences for you?
I would say, in comparison, sort of in decoupled architecture, and for instance, like in Hygraph, there is, again, just the ability to customize much more and actually create models that fit right into your sort of business goals or needs. And I think that that is sort of the power of decoupled architecture, right? However, I think that it's important to note that those capabilities are there, but it's up to education and sort of pushing that sort of behavioral narrative of how you go about content modeling and how you come up with a content strategy that is just as important as the actual technical tool itself. And I think that even though we have lots of decoupled to architecture options out there, we still have, maybe I would say, a lot of developers building content models that are not necessarily informed by the rest of the folks who are, within the organization. And that's not the developer's fault. It's sort of, again, the nature of how your organization works. And a lot of organizations, when they get really big, they become very siloed out, and there's lack of communication. There is also sort of this, I'm going to go off on a conflict tangent just for a second. So I'm studying peace and sort of conflict, and really specifically conflict resolution. And there's this sort of concept of intractable conflicts, right? Which is it's a long-standing conflict that sort of, it's not unsolvable, but it kind of has like a stalemate, and it also goes in sort of ups and downs. And I think that the developer and editor relationship can be very much that way when there's, when communication isn't good and when those relationships aren't solid, right? You can have a disconnect between what is being built and what is being used and those two groups don't ever communicate or talk to each other. And it's super important that we get to a place where, okay, we have this decoupled architecture. That's fantastic. This is a great tool that allows us to make custom content models. We can customize our process. But if everyone is not communicating, it doesn't benefit you as well as it could be, right? There are a lot of content models being built, like I said before, that are not informed, in which case that's not going to be ultimately beneficial for the developer in the long run. It's not beneficial for the editor, and it's not beneficial for the organization in the long run, because you're just going to create and replicate perhaps some silos that you already have.
Yeah, that's been
And I
a
think that
frustration. I was just gonna say it's been a frustration of mine when I watch the headless decoupled world unfold. It's not a huge frustration, because I think a lot of people are kind of, their models and their workflows and stuff are replicating the old monolith, but at least they've decoupled it. They have like developers working on the CM. There's a separation of concerns that you have back-end developers working on the CMS and front-end developers working on the website. So bingo, you at least have that. But there's still that a little additional thing. But that dynamic you were just talking about, that what do you call it, the intractable conflicts, it seems like there's both an opportunity to address them in these new decoupled architectures, but also maybe some potential for new kinds of conflict or misunderstandings. Do you have, like, I hope you have some success stories.
I do, for sure. And one of the things, like, as far as like the conflict can be positive and negative, right? And I think that very much that relationship, the relationship between developer and editor in its current status, is very much an opportunity to be creative and to use technology, which I believe technology fully is just another tool for humans. It is another sort of tool or application that you can use to infuse collaboration into your organizational culture, right? Because at the end of the day, that is also what's super important when you're implementing if you're moving to decoupled architecture, or moving to any, or implementing any new technical situation. What matters most and how you can make the most successful implementation possible is change management, right? And so when you get into change management, that is where it's important to have a foundation of collaborative organizational culture. We have open communication. I know what team B and C are doing, even though I'm on team A.
Yeah, that when you talk about change management, so much of that, it's like you need levers and ways to dive into that. I wonder if federation as a concept is a thing. Does that help in that sort of, like, like nobody's going to bust silos anytime soon, but federation seems like a good way to span silos, to connect them, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Does that make sense, that link between federation and change management?
Yeah, because if we think about the actual sort of human aspect of federation, or what federation actually means, the literal definition of federation is a group of states with a central government, but independence in internal affairs, right? So if we apply that to an organization, all of the different teams would be the different states, right? And the organization itself is the central government. And I think that federation is twofold. Content federation, or any other technical type of federation, is best implemented when you have human federation, right? And I think that, like, that is something that needs to be talked about more, is sort of how we bring these organizations and groups within organizations together and create those relationships, right? The human sort of model of all of this.
Yeah, no, and that's the big, because I've seen that, like that, and the change model there, or the change challenge there, is like at least popping your head up out of the silo, and looking around a little bit, if not like fully leaping out of the silo and embracing your colleagues. Yeah.
And as a developer, I will just say nothing has been more eye-opening and humbling is watching someone use something that I've built. And I think that that is such an important experience that a lot of developers need to have, because one, you learn so much, and it, and a lot of times it doesn't have the ideal situation, right? Is that that happens during the process of you building it and before you learn about the initial way in which someone you are building something for does their work, right? But it's okay if that doesn't happen. You can still sort of iterate on that and have that sort of insight later, and then iterate upon whatever it is you've built. And that's what's so great to me about decoupled architecture and federation, is it does, because things are decoupled, it gives you that opportunity to iterate and make small adaptations and customizations as needed when you get new sources or you get new insight or information. And that includes, oh, I thought this particular team or content person or editor was doing this way, but it turns out when I watch them and what they actually, the goal or the task they actually need to accomplish is this, and what I built doesn't quite match up with that. Decoupled architecture and sort of federation allows you to make those adjustments more on the fly.
Yeah, and that's sort of like, it's often rolled out as like a generic benefit of decoupled architectures, is that separation of concerns, that you can kind of do things in parallel and reduce some of the unproductive friction that can happen in these kinds of relationships. And then federation is, I guess, that to contextualize that, it's more like that's the new practice that stitches it back together.
Yes. Yeah. So recoupling everything. And that includes recoupling the organization, right? And also sometimes the organization wasn't coupled to begin with. That happens all the time, right? But this can be a way to sort of slowly on-ramp and use this sort of technology and these tools to start the process of coupling your organization, right? Even if you didn't have it prior to.
It seems like, so much there's like, a lot of that stuff has to happen top down, but this seems like these relationships down below in these decoupled architectures, the necessity of operating in these new ways, it seems like there's sort of maybe a bottom up potential for change. I mean, I think the real change, you're still going to have support from the top, but does that make sense to you? Do you feel opportunities in these new ways of operating that maybe can begin to span some silos in some of these orgs?
I definitely think so. And I think that, bottom up approaches to something like federation can work in that if you have teams, right? And let's say maybe upper management or other business leaders in the organization aren't totally sold on it. But if you have, like, for instance, a developer team and maybe one of the main content editing teams or the content editing team, if they all have buy-in as a group, they can be sort of a living proof of concept to show that this way of doing things works, and you can get buy-in from the bottom up by sort of managing up and showing, well, we've tried this thing out, this works, let's try to implement it across the organization. But in general, I would say it's best to have sort of top-down sort of buy-in too with your idea, but sometimes people need to actually see the benefits and see how it works together to get that buy-in. People might not always initially just give the buy-in just from hearing about it. These things can feel very abstract, but if you can show a proof of concept and you can show and show how this increases, productivity, or it increases sort of user engagement, right? Or these sort of things, then you have a very sort of real concept that, like, this sort of federation or decoupled architecture that we implemented really works, and it gets us these results. We also work more efficiently, which a lot of times can be quantifiable.
Yeah, and that idea of, show, don't tell, and start small, don't boil the ocean. Proof of concept is perfect for that, and a classic way of doing bottom up stuff. Hey, Lo, I can't believe it. We're already coming up close to time. These things always go.
That happens so fast.
It's not like, well, yeah, think about it. Decoupled days, we were talking for an hour. It's like, so anyhow. But before we wrap up, is there anything last? Is there anything that's come up in the conversation that you want to elaborate on, or just that you want to make sure we get to before we wrap up?
Um, let's see. I think that I just want to reiterate that, like, as a developer and now as a DevRel, I want to impress upon my fellow developers and the developer community to remember that you are building tools that humans are going to use, and to think about those humans. And also, I think from the other side of their perspective, if you are an editor and administrator, you can also engage in that process, whether or not you've been asked to or not, and say, hey, I want to show you how I actually do the work because I want us to build the best product possible, particularly when it comes to something like customizable CMS or our content models. And I think that, like, that can quickly dispel and sort of de-escalate any sort of friction that there may be, because it's in pursuit of us, everybody in the group trying to work together and, have the best workflow and process.
I love that. I love the way you're wrapping this up by showing some of the benefits and new opportunities for collaboration that arise from this stuff. So, well, thanks. Hey, one very last thing, Lo. What's the best way for folks to stay in touch if they want to follow you on social media or connect?
So you can find me on Twitter at Lois Wren, LOWISREN, or you can always email me at Hygraph. My email is LO .Etheridge, which is ETHERIDGE at hygraph.com.
Well, thanks so much, Lo. Always fun to talk with you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. This was awesome. I could talk about this forever.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.